You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, I'm Cindy Cisneros, Vice President, Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf. This book discussion podcast series is brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, which is International Women's Day, go ladies, we are honored to have Jennifer Barrett, the head of content at Fidelity Investments and author of the book, Think Like a Breadwinner, a wealth-building manifesto for women who want to earn more and worry less, published last year by Penguin Random House. Nearly half of working women in the US are their household's main breadwinner, yet most women still aren't being brought up to think like breadwinners. In fact, women are discouraged by decades-long institutional bias and cultural conditioning, from building their own wealth, pursuing their full earning potential, and providing for themselves and others financially. This podcast edition, with financial expert Jennifer Barrett, will reframe what it means to be a breadwinner, and she will answer questions on how she got to where she is today. Jennifer, a hearty welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
And we are thrilled to have you, and we'll dive right in. So with the opening question, what prompted you to write this book?
You know, as you mentioned, over the last decade, there was a paradigm shift in the breadwinning model with a record number of women moving into the main provider role. So at the start of the pandemic, moms were either the main or the sole breadwinner in more than 40% of households with kids under 18, a record number. And we know that during the pandemic, women have been disproportionately affected. So that number may have come down a little bit, but the fact remains that women's earnings are increasingly important. So we know that even in single parent families, there are 10 million single parent families right now. Nearly 80% of them are headed by women. And we know that women are staying single longer than ever before. So bottom line, more of us are breadwinners for our household, even if it's a household of one. And yet, many of us are still not being raised to think like breadwinners, encouraged to plan our careers or our job paths strategically to support the lives and maybe the family we want, or to build good credit so we can buy a home one day. Most women are not taught how to invest and build wealth, or even given the message of how critically important it is for us to do that, and not just for retirement. And it leaves us disempowered. It leaves us at a severe disadvantage as we get older, and it makes us vulnerable. So I wrote this book to help empower women to build their own wealth and support the lives that they want, whether or not they have a partner. It's really intended to fill the gaps that so many of us have when it comes to taking care of ourselves financially and feeling confident in our capabilities and secure in our future. And I also had my own wake-up call, which makes this book a little bit more personal too.
That certainly always helps when it is personal and makes it that much more meaningful in addressing and developing the material. So can you talk to us more about what is the real breadwinning mindset? What does that really mean to think like a breadwinner?
Right. So, it's a lesson that I learned myself, as I mentioned, in my early 30s, because I actually thought I was doing everything right. I had a good job. I was an editor at a national magazine then. I was married. I was paying half the bills. I was putting a little bit in my 401k and savings and paying off my credit card debt. But I remember one night in particular, I was trying to get our toddler, or he was a toddler at the time, our son, Zach, back to sleep. He was about 18 months old. And I have this very vivid recollection of pacing back and forth in our little one-bedroom apartment and looking around as I was trying to get him back to sleep. And it hit me that if I wanted to grow my family and help buy a home for us, I was really going to need to step up and save and invest more for our future. And that realization kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, because I had considered myself to be pretty independent and pretty savvy financially. And so I really had to stop and ask myself, why hadn't I come to this conclusion already? Why wasn't I taking these steps already? And I realized that I'd been subconsciously depending on my husband to take the lead when it came to our finances. My dad had been the sole primary breadwinner for most of my childhood. And I think subconsciously, I just assumed that my husband would take the lead as well. So I asked myself, What if I had been raised to think like a breadwinner instead? If I grew up thinking that I would be fully responsible for my financial future and probably for others too, would that change the choices I made with my money? And the answer was yes. And that's really where it started, was thinking like a breadwinner and starting to make choices that brought me closer to the future that I wanted and being much more actively involved to ensure that that future happened. So what it comes down to when we talk about the breadwinner mindset is that there is a material difference between being able to cover the bills and building wealth to support the life you want now and in the future. It's kind of the difference between thinking like a budgeter and thinking like a breadwinner. Many women are raised to think more like a budgeter than a breadwinner, to be focused on paying the bills, balancing the budget, stretching their dollars versus thinking expansively about building wealth and really creating the kind of life that you want and then making financial choices to support that life. So it's a very clear distinction that became clear to me personally. And then as I spoke to other women, I realized that I wasn't alone, that so many women had been raised that way. So you could be very successful professionally even and still feel like, I wouldn't say a failure financially necessarily, but still lack that confidence financially. And there was, almost a disconnect in the confidence that we felt in our careers, but lacked with our finances.
I wonder too, because I fall into that category of, it not being raised as a breadwinner. Like, what different choices would I have made? And why do you think women are still less comfortable embracing that breadwinner, status, even though a lot more women now hold that role within their family?
I think to your point, most women simply were not raised to think this way. And this cultural messaging that we get reinforces these ideas that our income is less important, that wealth building is not for us, and that we are more likely to manage the household budget than the investments. So I interviewed 100 women for this book, and as I mentioned, I spoke with some who were professionally successful, but that didn't translate to their finances. They didn't feel as confident financially. They had never been taught the skills many times, and the assumption was that someone else would make those financial decisions and be the one to manage the finances. A lot of that comes back to our childhood, and I don't actually think it's intentional. But research shows that even today, parents still often speak differently to their daughters about money than they do to their sons. So they are more likely to teach their girls how to budget and spend smartly, and they're more likely to teach their sons how to build credit and how to invest. And we know that those are critical skills for everyone, but women are less likely to get those lessons or even to get the message of how important it is to grow their wealth. And as I mentioned, that's often reinforced culturally. So Anne Bowden, who is the CEO of the British bank Starling, commissioned a study, really interesting study a few years ago, where she looked at 300 money-related articles. It was a linguistic study, really digging into the language in those articles. And what they found was that the majority of those money articles aimed at women suggested spending less, while the vast majority that were aimed at men really focused on making money, investing, and building wealth. So that all may help explain why women have more credit card debt, why we have lower credit scores than men, and why the gender wealth gap is so large. Among single men and women, single women have 32 cents of wealth for every dollar that a man has. So that is significantly larger than the gender pay gap that we talk about a lot, and which is important too. But we can't forget that it's really wealth that helps us become more independent. And so it's so important not just to be thinking about our earning power, but to be taught how to invest those earnings so that we can work toward true independence.
So it's interesting in hearing you talk about the messaging, and it does go back to our earliest years in childhood. So that's a lot of years of reinforcement of these particular, cultural assumptions. And it does impact, as you were saying, the research shows how that affects the money choices, women are making, and that they end up more in debt. And just as an aside, there's been more interest in terms of the K through 12 system for both boys and girls, and introducing more financial literacy in general, big picture.
Amen. Yes.
Which is excellent to see, especially ahead of making choices for additional post-secondary education, whether that's college or additional training. as it relates to taking on debt, student loans, and so forth. So there are some aspects that are starting to be addressed, although that is different. We're, specifically when you're talking about that cultural conditioning, again, over decades, how does that hold women back at work?
Well, this assumption that men will be the breadwinners and women will be the caregivers, and that our income is secondary, can still inform behavior at home and at work. So we know that women still pick up most of the household and caregiving responsibilities, even if we earn more. And we saw this throughout the pandemic, even in families where dads were working from home too, women still disproportionately picked up those responsibilities. So, some of it starts at home and having those conversations with your partner and really finding an equitable way to split up both the household's caregiving duties and then, the breadwinning duties. And, ultimately you want a partnership that feels equitable. And so neither partner should be picking up more than the other one or feel like they are. But, it still holds true that women do tend to pick up most of those responsibilities, regardless of how much they earn. And this spills over, interestingly, into the workplace in that men tend to focus more on promotable work that will help advance their career and their earnings, while research shows that women are actually more likely to take on what's called office housework and other non-promotable work than men are. So that's, think of the woman who cleans up the conference room after a meeting, or if someone's asked to plan a birthday party for somebody, or the one who sends out the meeting notes after a meeting. Not only are women more likely to pick up that kind of work, but both men and women are more likely to delegate that work to women. So some of this is awareness, really, awareness in what we're doing in the workplace and what we're accepting and where we're drawing the lines. And there are, obviously there are nice ways to deflect when you're asked to pick up that kind of work. And some of it is thinking about the kind of messaging that we're giving to other women in the workplace and making sure that we're not perpetuating, these outdated stereotypes. The other research that I looked at showed that women, and I think this is relatively common knowledge, that men are more likely to go for promotions than women are. If you look at the list of criteria for a role, men are likely to go for it even if they've hit 50 to 60%, while women really try to tick off nearly 100% before they're willing to go for it. And so there's some research out there. I think some of it sort of uncovers external barriers, and we can talk a little bit more about the policies. I know how involved you are in that and how passionate you are on some of these topics. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, though, is more internal barriers, right? And a matter of awareness, and really being aware of the way that we are interacting with each other in the workplace, being aware of the biases that we may be bringing into the workplace. And then also as women, I think we can really focus on, is the work I'm doing promotable? How can I really plan my career? Staying one step ahead of it at all times and really thinking that way. It's sort of, I hate to say thinking like a man, because I think there are plenty of women out there who are thinking strategically about their careers, but it is important to be really aware of the fact that we are more likely to take on this work that's not promotable, that's not recognizable, that doesn't pay off. And what that does is leave us stretched, and it makes it harder for us to focus on the work that really will pay off, that really will lead to those promotions. So we have to be really strategic.
And it's been interesting when you were talking about the pandemic, we really have learned a few things. As devastating as it has been on so many levels, it did open eyes of many in the employer community in terms of different aspects of their employees, including women and families having to now deal with kids being at home because schools were closed, and other individuals lost jobs. It's a huge domino effect. And, it has forced, if you will, a rethinking, of the workplace, and what do we need to support, employees in their full potential and making things manageable, especially for those that have families. So is there a way that we can surmount, some of these deeply ingrained cultural, barriers? Awareness building definitely should be, part of that, so that we can, how can we help make an impact on those mindsets of both, at the government level as well as the employer level, so that both private and public sectors are working together and trying to help increase that awareness and create policies and practices that support, working families.
Absolutely. It sort of runs the gamut, right? We've all heard about the motherhood penalty, for example, with women earning less for each child we have, and the fatherhood bonus with men seeing an earnings bump when they become fathers, and so that is a question of awareness, yes, but I think part of it is policy too, right? We still don't have mandated paid parental leave. There's been data out recently in instances where there is paid leave that shows that women still disproportionately take significantly more time than their male partners do if they're in a heterosexual relationship. And so part of it is policy, right? Part of it is implementing policies like paid parental leave that support all, working families. But the other piece of it is that if you implement that policy, but then women disproportionately take advantage of it and the men are not taking advantage of it, it won't solve the problem fully. So there's the policy component to it. And then I don't know if it's an incentive component or if it's a cultural component or some combination of the two. I found it really interesting in studying some of the Scandinavian countries that have had more success with their paid leave policies in terms of seeing significantly higher numbers of fathers taking on that leave. And there was a whole public awareness campaign that they did when they kind of relaunched the program recently, where they had a lot of traditionally kind of macho, masculine looking men that were well known, holding babies and baby Bjorns or baby carriers and talking about taking leave. And so I think that really speaks to the fact that it's not just a policy issue, but that there's there's some culturally ingrained beliefs that sometimes, prevent the policy from having the impact that we want it to have. So a piece of it is policy and a piece of it is building awareness about some of these biases, and then also creating a culture where, where everyone feels like they can take advantage of policies like these and they won't be penalized in their careers, but that they're actually, encouraged. And I was thrilled when I joined Fidelity last summer to find that this is the case at Fidelity. And I think there are several companies that are really making big efforts to encourage both parents to take paid parental leave, for example, that are having an impact, but we have a ways to go still.
We do. And on the international front, and I'm glad you touched on that, we're the only OECD country that does not have a universal pre-K program. So that
or paid leave.
Yeah, exactly right. Both sets of policies.
Yes.
And it does have it affirms and deepens that cultural bias and impact, that there isn't as strong of a focus, on the family or children or working families. And it continues to impact policies. We know that, so there is a lot of work. It sounds like that can be done, and opportunities to build awareness and think about policies both internally within companies as well as externally, with government. But we do know, and you do cite some examples in your book, there are some companies that really are taking steps in that direction. In terms of awareness building, doing their own assessments in terms of policies and practices, and creating change. And so hoping, do you think that the cultural expectations now are really changing for younger women in the upcoming generation?
I'd like to think so. I'm hopeful. I do think as a culture, we still tend to pigeonhole men as breadwinners and women as caregivers. But the reality is that those roles are shifting in millions of households today. And I think particularly in younger households, there's not as perhaps as hard a division, both in terms of labor and caregiving as there used to be. So I think more couples are trying to determine a breakdown of those household caregiving and financial responsibilities that feels fair and works for them, rather than being informed by cultural expectations. I do think, as I mentioned before, I think we have a little ways to go, but I'm encouraged by what we're seeing. I think it's much more common, for example, anecdotally, to see, men picking up their kids from school, or to see men in a playground, with their children. I think it's much more acceptable. And this, has a lot to do, I think, with the pandemic in a lot of ways. For someone to say, I need to take my child to the doctor, or, for that line between our professional and personal lives, it's gotten a little bit blurrier, especially in the pandemic. And we're actually able to acknowledge that we have a family, we have a life outside of work. And I certainly remember early in my career when I had my first child, feeling like I couldn't really talk about my children at all. And certainly remember feeling the anxiety of having to, pick a child up who got sick at school, or take a child to the doctor, and really worrying that what the perception might be in the workplace, that I'm not as committed to my career, or whatever those kind of lingering perceptions could be. And I think we've all become very aware in the last 2 years that we can be quite capable and competent in our jobs, while also managing whatever parental responsibilities we have if we're parents, or managing whatever personal responsibilities we have. And it's encouraging. I think that, I remember that the BBC anchor where his wife and the children came into the background, and remember it went viral. It was such a, it was viral, and everyone was talking about it, and it created such a stir. And now we are so accustomed to seeing pets and children, spouses in the background of our Zoom calls, that I think, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that, it's a recognition that we're human beings and we have full lives, and our jobs are not the only aspect of our lives that are important to us. And so the fact that I think we can talk about that a little bit more openly now than perhaps we have in the past, will in the long run be a really good thing for us as a culture. And I think even from a work productivity standpoint, just acknowledging the fact that you can do very good work in the boundaries of your work time and still be able to have a life and be able to fulfill on those responsibilities outside of work too, is hugely important. We also learned that you can work remotely and be very effective in your job. Not in every job, obviously, there's a certain level of privilege there, but I think in a lot of white collar jobs, you can quite effectively perform your responsibilities remotely. And I think that will go a long way, even as we're hopefully seeing the end of the pandemic, or a new normal where it's not as disruptive to our lives as it has been, where we end up in perhaps some kind of hybrid model, which will be great for working parents, I would think, giving us all flexibility, but also great for everybody, because you don't have to have children to have responsibilities, outside of work, and other commitments outside of work. So, having more flexibility, moving in that direction, being able to talk about our lives outside of work. I think the fact that we're even talking about paid parental leave again, that is top of mind. It was mentioned in the State of the Union address again. I mean, we're not there yet, but we're still talking about it. So I think all of that is very encouraging. We're moving in the right direction. Even though we've got a ways to go, I think we're moving in a really positive direction.
It's good to hear that we are moving in a positive direction. So as you think back, what financial lessons do you wish you'd learned earlier that you know now?
I mean, honestly, I think if everybody had the expectation, and this is the case in other cultures, that you live on 80% of what you make and you save and invest the rest. So just looking at your paycheck and saying, actually, it's 80% is what I'm making, right? And the rest is for my future. We would be in a far different place than we are today, with, fears of people outliving their money, and the perpetual headlines about Americans not having enough savings to cover an unexpected emergency expense. And I'm very sympathetic to the fact that, a large proportion of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, or feel that they're living paycheck to paycheck. But I think part of it is culturally we've normalized debt, and we really haven't reinforced the message of how important it is to live on less and invest the rest early on. So,
and we're living longer too. That's a variable.
Right, which is great, but we don't want to outlive our money.
Exactly.
So, no, it is really important that we think about it early on, because time is such an important factor in our ability to build our wealth. And I tell people a lot, like, we should be thinking of every paycheck as an opportunity to become less dependent on the next paycheck. And for me, that was a real shift in my thinking, was really looking at every paycheck as an opportunity to become less dependent on the next paycheck. So it was, how little of that paycheck can I live on? How much can I put toward my future? And I think once you start to move in that direction and you get some momentum, behind your investments, and you see them growing, it becomes much easier to do that. But the message we give so often is not aligned with that. It's really about growing your paycheck more than growing your wealth. And living paycheck to paycheck is such a normal event in America that, if you are able to save anything at all, it often feels like a win. And so I think, as leaders, we have a responsibility to really try and shift that mindset, encourage everybody to participate in, our 401ks or 403bs, to make sure they're getting at least the match, which isn't the case often in many companies. People just leave money on the table. So really doubling down on the importance of investing, not just building your career, but building your wealth.
And as we close out our time today, our last question is, what are other top takeaways from all the research that you've done that could help benefit for the women listening today?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to reinforce that it's not about our capabilities. We are absolutely capable of, being very successful financially. And then obviously there are plenty of women probably listening to this today who are financially successful. But these beliefs that we are not as good as investing, that we are not as capable with our finances, are just culturally ingrained in us. It's not about our capabilities, but about our cultural conditioning, and shifting our mindset around that. And a lot of times we just don't realize how deeply cultural conditioning can impact the choices that we make. And so that's why the book was so focused on mindset, because I think it's just as important as learning the skills. And the fact is, whether you're the main breadwinner in your household or not, you can benefit from thinking like one, knowing that you are making choices with your money that will support you and the life you want, whether you're sharing it with a partner or not. It provides confidence and peace of mind. And I really hope that every woman can experience that and pass on the kind of messaging and guidance to their daughters and to younger women that they may influence, that will empower them to make financial choices that will allow them to experience true independence as well.
And I think a lot of those great takeaways and lessons learned are so well articulated in your manifesto. And I have to say, I think that the manifesto, that your book was so much more than that, because you also included exercises and guidance and directions and things to explore, and a lot of great resources to access, in addition to the conversations about the bigger picture of policies, both in the public and private sectors. So, Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views on thinking like a breadwinner. It has been a delight to speak with you, and we really appreciate your time. I am encouraging all our listeners to pick up your book, Think Like a Breadwinner, a wealth building manifesto for women who want to earn more and worry less. And you can also learn more about Jennifer and her journey on her website at www.jenniferbarrett.com. Also, as a closing note, the conference board will be hosting a Women Lead 2032 festival, which will take place later this fall from September 29th to the 30th at the Westin, New York, at Times Square in New York City. And you can register at the conferenceboard.org/events/women. And we wish a happy International Women's Day to all.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.